Well, hello, DL, also known as Danielle Mayfield. Welcome to the Border Summit. Thank you so much for taking your time and coming all the way from Oregon via this video to share with us at the Border Summit today. I was so intrigued and so happy just by some of the work that you're doing, that I felt you were such a relevant voice to some of the topics and the themes that we are going to be discussing here. And so thank you for being on.
Yeah, it's awesome. And how are you doing in Minneapolis? Is it snowing right now?
It was snowing this last weekend. Easter, obviously, was a really cold, just another winter day, but things are getting better. I think next week's going to be in the 60s. So I think that's going to be really good for all of us, health-wise and emotional-wise. So how are you doing? How's your family? How are you guys spending time at home right now?
Yeah, we're doing good. My kids are enjoying all the family time. The weather has been nice, but yeah, it feels a little bit like Groundhog Day. I walk my neighborhood, 2 times a day, and I see the same few people, and we have the same conversation from far away. And oh man, we're 5 weeks into this, so yeah, it's getting real.
Yeah, definitely a different time, right? Definitely an intentional time. I think that my wife and I were talking just over lunch earlier today, and we were saying how, like never this time. I hope that we don't forget it. I hope that we don't miss it, because we've never had it before, right? Yeah. And so I think it's an intentional time too. But at the same time, it's like some people are saying their houses are like as clean as they've ever been. I don't know about you, but my wife and I, we don't have that time at all. No.
That's not how I cope. No.
So for those tuning in, so who is DL Mayfield? I know that I follow your writing, and I follow just a lot of content that you put on online, and I follow your voice, and I think it's relevant to this conversation. So just tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I am someone who grew up in the U.S., a pastor's kid. I was homeschooled. I was really come from the evangelical American experience, and I wanted to be a missionary from a really young age. And I ended up going to Bible college and then volunteering with some recently arrived Somali Bantu refugees here in Portland while I was going to Bible college. And that really flipped my whole world upside down and sort of allowed me to experience that the world can be bad news for some people, right? And so refugees are people who have already sort of experienced the end of their world and now are trying to restart in another place. And Portland is just really hard for people who don't fit into the dominant culture. And so I was able to sort of experience Portland as bad news through the eyes of my new friends. And I also had some questions about my religion and my faith and what did it mean to a group of people who actually were non-literate, so they couldn't read the Bible. They were Muslim, right? They were pretty poor, all this stuff. There's so many barriers to the way I had been taught, like this is how you share your faith and this is how people convert. And instead of just walking away when it became clear they weren't going to convert like that, I really felt God saying, I want you to stick around. I want you to keep hanging out here. There's something here. And actually, God is at work in those communities. And so me and my husband, we got married and we ended up moving into low-income housing with refugee families. And that's kind of where we've been living ever since for the past 12 years in refugee and immigrant neighborhoods. And it's been a blast. It's so incredible. It's just been... usually I have to pinch myself. I'm just so happy to be in these spaces, just interpersonally, the friendships I've created and the community we found and even the safety of our relationships. And I did go and get my master's in teaching English to speakers of other languages. And I specialize in people who don't have literacy backgrounds. And so usually it's women who through some form of trauma, we're not able to access education in their backgrounds. And so that's mostly who I end up getting to know first in my primary relationships. I will say right now, it's a really challenging time for me because I always thought if something big went down, I'd just be so happy to be in my neighborhood with a bunch of survivors, right? Yeah. But I never really thought I wouldn't be able to like hang out with them in their apartments. And so I know you wanted to talk a little bit about American individualism today and this idol of safety a lot of us have. right now it's just so challenging for those of us who maybe already are exploring how God wants us to be a good neighbor here and now. What that means when maybe to keep people safe, we need to stay home. I'm sure you're probably experiencing some of those tensions too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's hard. And so I guess the last part of my story is I ended up starting to write articles, and then I wrote a book, and I'm actually my second book is coming out too, just all about these themes of what it means to grow up in the sort of dominant religious culture of America, and to really try and take Jesus seriously when it comes to loving our neighbors as ourselves. And honestly, the values of American individualism and American exceptionalism can really be at odds with that desire to put other people above me and my own family.
I think that's good. Thank you for taking us there, I think, right away, because as I want to highlight, I think a conversation I wanted to have with you was this very individualistic culture that we live in, right? And even as COVID-19 hit, I think I was wrestling with that because our office had shut down here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our teams were working from home. Our neighbors were all at home. But then you saw scenes in different parts of the country. And obviously, right, it wasn't, COVID-19 wasn't spreading in other places as fast, maybe, as it did in certain places. But I think your article on Sojourners was really timely because you highlighted this topic of American individualism versus loving our neighbors. And even though I think, even though we live in, I think you hit it right on, right? Like, I think safety, we cannot dismiss the safety of others, right?
Mm-hmm.
And be, I would even use the word, I think, negligent as we look only at ourselves and look only at what is affecting us versus if it's not right in front of us, it's not affecting other people. And I feel like that was hard for me because I think in a time that it is unprecedented where we can't even literally, right, physically be with our neighbors, how do we still love them? How do we move past our personal safety from our homes, because that's so important right now, to stay home but still continue loving, the others amongst us. So tell us a little bit about that article. What evoked, I guess, that writing?
Yeah, so in my writing, I try and just pay attention to what is sticking out to me, and I think that's a really important skill we can all develop right now. Is we need to sort of pay attention to what we're seeing, pay attention to what is standing out to us, and try and be curious instead of maybe defensive about all these conflicting stories we're hearing and conflicting desires within our own hearts. So for me, I just saw on Twitter like a picture of the Pope in Vatican City, like giving his homily to an empty square, right? And then I also saw this image of people, I think March 15th was like the last day Disney World was open in Florida, and people just flocked to it. They knew that was going to be the last day, so everybody went there, and they were all crowded together and like in the happiest place of earth, just trying to feel a sense of normalcy, which, that's like the last thing you're supposed to do when you have a transmittable virus happening. And so those two images just really stuck out to me. Just this religious leader, preaching to an empty square in order to love people better and to keep people safe, right? And Italy was really in the throes of the virus at that point. And then looking at Americans flocking to Disney World. And so I just thought that was fascinating. And one thing I really wondered is this desire for our individual rights and individual liberty that is a part of many people's American mindset, like, is that fundamentally at odds with loving your neighbor as yourself? I don't know. This is a question I have because honestly, I kind of think it is. And I think we just swim in the waters when we're born and raised here, to the point that we don't even know how much this desire for liberty shapes us. So I've been paying attention to, Facebook and all that. And I have an acquaintance I used to work with who's very religious, very Christian. And most of what she posts has to do about God. And she posted the other day that, she was really not happy with the shelter in place order, and especially the fact that you could maybe get a misdemeanor if you chose to break those orders. And she said, it's not that I don't want people to be safe. I just don't want my freedoms taken away from me. And so I think she's just making it plain, right? Like,
Yeah.
I guess, of course, we want people to be safe, but I really don't want my freedom taken from me. And so I just straight up asked her, like, okay, but which is more important? And we are truly in a moment where we have to choose. Yeah. And a lot of people on her post said, my freedom, or our freedom, is more important than your life. That's what somebody said to me, and to your neighbor's life. And what's fascinating is, like, this is not a theoretical conversation we're having. Yeah. This is an actual conversation. And I think what grieves me is we have seen a little bit the publicity of Christians being really vocal about, you know, the government shouldn't take away our right to congregate and to worship together. And I don't live in fear. I live in faith. When really, I would say the majority of Christians I know are not doing that. They are actually really wondering, like, like, I think we need to stay home to love our neighbor. And I would really love to see the church especially reclaim this beautiful history Christians in particular have of prioritizing the common good over individual needs. And we can do that right now through our safety measures and trying to keep public safety by staying at home, even though it's really hard for me because so many people are in need and I want to go out and help. And then I think long term, what we are going to have to think about is prioritizing the economic good, right? Prioritizing the good of immigration and people who are fleeing situations, like some are now finding themselves in America where they're like, wow, we have no resources. We have no safety net. Nobody's coming to help us. We might need to think about changing our living situation. We're going to need to think about prioritizing the common good when it comes to healthcare. Like, there's a lot to think about as far as how an American Christian can step into this new reality, because I think what COVID-19 has really shown us is that there's always been inequality in the U.S., and it's just getting exposed for how deep it truly is. And as someone who believes Jesus, when he said the entire Old Testament, the entire law and prophets can be summed up in two things, which is love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That's going to have to radically reorient my life after all this, right? It's just going to have to.
No. Yeah, I think that's what I've been kind of wrestling with. I think the idea of, like, do I want life to just go back to normal, or is this a time for me to sit back, reflect, and even go deeper into some of these things that should matter in my life, right? And how do I live those out? It's kind of like, in some ways, it's kind of like a reset, right? We didn't ask for it, but I think God is just literally allowing us this time, because I do truly believe, like, even though I don't fully understand it, like, we are living in God's will, right? And it's like, well, okay, Lord, well, how do we use that time? What's the lesson here, right? And so I hope that this is a time where we can, kind of just change our priorities, change the way we look at others and serve others. What are you hearing in your own community? I mean, immigrants, refugees, friends that you have, maybe even from across the country. I mean, is there a message that is cohesive, or that everybody has? Is it struggle? Is it hope? What is it?
Yeah, I think it's hard for me to say, because I am someone who has not experienced forced migration, and I'm just somebody that's been in these communities a little bit. And from what I heard, it's quite a mixed bag, right? So already, as I mentioned, a lot of people who have already experienced forced migration are survivors, right? So they've survived a lot. They're just like, we're going to keep our heads down and we're going to survive again. Yeah. I think it is a little hard for anybody, including collectivist communities, to understand trying to keep public safety, right? A part of it. And so the people are getting that. I do think that I was super worried about everybody I know losing their jobs, but it turns out many of them work in essential jobs. And I think that's really important for us, again, to take a moment to say, like, 7-Elevens are keeping some neighborhoods afloat right now. A lot of my friends work at 7-Eleven. And so overnight bakeries, just these jobs that maybe in Portland, none of these jobs pay a livable wage, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. They just don't. And so now I hope when we think about this later, we'll say the people who work at our grocery stores deserve a livable wage. And so I see them keeping us afloat. I see them hanging in there, and yet at the same time, there is a fear about the long-term economic implications. I know that food banks are already starting to run out of money and donations in our area, and it is scary. And so I don't want to gloss it over by saying like, oh, people are survivors, they're going to be fine. I think no, there's an opportunity for us to demand safety nets for people and to really change our perception of essential workers and what human rights people should have access to. I'm so happy my city of Portland and our little neighboring city of Gresham has stopped evictions and is actually going to penalize landlords that choose to evict people during this time. And so stuff like that, I'm like, this is great. We need, moving forward, we need rent control. We need renters' rights. We need all this. And so my personality is to go to a little bit of the silver lining, which is let's just go full bore into, promoting human dignity and promoting human rights across the board in our own communities. And I think, I don't know, it could be sobering for some people who are not familiar with the inequality in America, maybe don't get a chance to see it up close, but things are not great for a lot of people in the United States. And I hope that's being made crystal clear to everyone.
Well, that's important, I think, because I sit here, right, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, sit here with more than plenty of food in my kitchen, very comfortable shelter, right, like my home. And at the same time, I think your voice, the work that you're doing, even like what the mission and vision of Border Perspective and why we work with communities that are vulnerable is because, we're trying to care for the other, and I can't not wrestle and deal with the privilege that I'm sitting in, literally, right? Mm-hmm. And I can order groceries and someone's delivering, and I can, not leave my home for anything that I need, but that's not the case for many other people in our country. So I think we're more than ever need to be mindful of that. So your book coming out, is it May 5th? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about it, the title, and just a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's called The Myth of the American Dream, Reflections on Affluence, Autonomy, Safety, and Power. And I wrote it over the past few years just because of my experiences living in the neighborhoods I do. And I think if people have the capacity to read right now, it's going to strike kind of relevant because, again, I think my thesis is that when people of privilege pursue a life revolving around these values of, collecting wealth for myself, like doing what's right for me and mine, not having my rights taken away from me, pursuing safety, and then, longing for power. And even if you want power, like to do good, right? Like these are values that in a really unequal and unjust society can turn people away from prioritizing the common good. And that's just something I've seen over and over again, politically, but also just relationally and sort of the vacuums we can find ourselves in. So yeah, that's the book. And I think right now is such a fascinating time of connections between all these values and how they're playing out. And it's a perfect time for someone who is a follower of Christ to say, oh my gosh, like how can we be called to take a step back and try, again and again and again to align ourselves with what Jesus's vision was for the world. And so right now, there's some passages in the scripture that are so important, I think, for all of us to be immersing ourselves in. One of the ones that I kind of frame my entire book around is Luke 4 with Jesus announcing his ministry. Jesus said he was here to be good news to the poor, to be good news to people who are blind, who don't have physical safety, to those who've been oppressed and those who've been in captivity. And then also I would say, the Beatitudes and the entire Sermon on the Mount is this radical reframing of, first of all, who's privileged in society, right? The meek and the poor in spirit. And I think our society is even, like I said, we're seeing who truly is a priority person right now? And how can we choose to value them with our votes, with our lives, with where we choose to send our kids to school, with who we go to church with who we follow on Twitter, with what books we read? Like we have this chance to radically reorient our lives and who we are prioritizing. And there's just so many ways to do that. I think, right now, while we're all stuck at home, it can be kind of hard, but my encouragement would be to people listening to this is, we don't want to go back to normal, as you already said.
Yeah.
But moving forward, if you feel a little stuck relationally, like I don't know anybody who's in need right now, and I don't know anybody who's suffering right now, but I want to help, that would be a great next step to take, right? Is to make sure you are connected to local efforts, prioritizing the needs of people who are most marginalized, right? And so right now, some people are receiving these stimulus checks, and there's all these grassroots efforts to say, like, if you don't need that check, if you're still getting money or income through somewhere else, like, find a way to donate that money, to redistribute that money, which is a totally biblical concept. You mentioned a fresh start. The Bible calls it Jubilee, right? And this economic practice of forgiving debts and of giving extra to your neighbor. And so, finding organizations that do work directly with undocumented families, donating to your local food bank, or, getting involved with organizations like yours who can actually create long-term relational pathways to work with people over the border. I think these are all just things we need to, if we're looking at what can we do next, it's like when the next bad thing happens, let's make sure we have these pathways in place for people who have to give of their excess and to be in long-term relationship. Because the charity model is not enough right now, as we are seeing, right? No, it's not. We need justice. We need those who are less affected to be in the trenches with their brothers and sisters who are suffering the most right now.
Yeah, more than ever, because, I think you said it well. I think what I'm hearing is nonprofits, they're letting people go. Some are shutting down, right. Obviously I think the last stat was 22 million people have filed for unemployment.
Oh my gosh.
At the morning, that's just unreal, right? And so everyone's impacted somehow, but I think and I consider myself, one of those people is like, okay, what are we doing? And in many ways, this Border Summit is bringing together voices so that, okay, how do we get past this initial shock? How do we mobilize? How do we help? How do we remain hopeful? Because so much of is that, and we remain hopeful through Christ, but tangibly, what does that look like, right? And I thank you for laying out some of those just practical opportunities. So do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I think a question I have that I just sort of wanted to ask you is, the title of your organization is Border Perspectives, and thinking about borders right now is just kind of a fascinating exercise, right? So most borders are pretty closed right now. How are you sort of processing your ministry as the world has kind of seen itself shut down, shelter in place? How has that kind of impacted the way you think about borders right now?
Yeah, for sure. Interestingly enough, part of just our vision is to broaden perspectives, and we do that by crossing over. Physically and literally, right? And so we do that by bringing people from different places to somewhere new and kind of inviting them into the perspective of the local people who are ministering there, working there, serving, volunteering, all this stuff. And so in a time like this, it's fascinating because even a couple of weeks ago, I remember hearing just right on the Mexico-U.S. border, when Mexico still had less cases than the Texas side of the border, all of a sudden, I saw the cards turning because governors on the Mexican side of the border were pleading to their Mexican president that the borders, would be shut to the Americans, to the Americans coming over because of the fear of, this invisible enemy that is, COVID-19. And so that was interesting because that was kind of a turn in conversation. I feel like, it's always been about the safety and the security of the American side of the border, but that all of a sudden with COVID-19 shifted. What I'm seeing too is that even in these times when borders, especially in the South Texas region, even though travel is restricted, there are still as safe as possible, people that are sacrificially giving and people that are sacrificially aiding to the most vulnerable. There's a particular church, and actually he's a contributor in the session, Pastor Abraham, and he's on the Mexican side of the border, and his church is feeding people every single afternoon, and these are, and this is in colonias that are in very much need right now. And so even in this time, even though we can't cross, everybody can't cross, even though we can't go visit my parents in Texas, right? Like we can't go visit the nearby friends or family members. And so that's hard. But the true encouragement and hope that I have too is finding that some of the people that I'm connected to who have had those restrictions placed on them before are hopeful. They're encouraging. And the thing about it is maybe some of us have never walked through something like this, and it's just like you said, but there's others around us that have. And so more than ever, I feel like their voices are more valuable if we take the time to listen.
That's a good word. Yeah.
And so, I don't know, that's part of what I'm hearing. That's part of what I'm wrestling with. And I hope that normal doesn't take us back to where we were before this, because we know the before, we know the now because we're living through it. And so the hope is that our future will be different.
Yes. Amen.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about that. Thank you so much for joining us on the Border Summit. We will definitely link some of your work below this video. And if people want to find more of your work, we'll also link your social media profiles and ways that they can contact you. And we also have a comment box. So if you're on here and you have any thoughts or questions, want to engage in this conversation, feel free to leave a comment below, and we will hopefully be engaging with each other and learning more together. So thank you so much, DL, and thank you for your contribution to this Border Summit.
Thank you so much.